Hello and welcome to another tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at how we can create some really cool hand painted materials. Now this is going to be an introduction to those techniques. We're going to be having a look at how we can create scratches, how we can create simple rock materials, and also how we can add destruction detail to these. Now before we start, let's have a look at the canvas that I've got set up. I'm going to link this PSD as it is now in the description box down below so that you guys can just open it up and start working. This is a really useful canvas to have set up in a PSD that you can kind of just open up and practice in. On the right hand side, let's have a look at some of these layers. Now my background layer is kind of a mid-grey. Anywhere from around here on the colour swatch works really well. Now the reason why I've used grey is because we're going to be using black and white as our shadows and our light. And this really helps enable contrast between those two things. If I had a white canvas, for instance, you wouldn't be able to see any of those highlights. And if I had a really dark grey canvas or black canvas, you wouldn't actually be able to see any of the detail. And this is why mid-grey works so well. Now I've got a few other layers. We're going to be looking at these later on, but all we need to know for now is that any initial outlines I create, I put in outline. Any depth shadows I put in place, I put shadows. And then of course any highlights, I put in light. Sharp highlights we'll go over later on, but for now that's all we need to know. So let's have a look at the brush settings I'm going to be using. These will all be set up for you, by the way, in the PSD, so when you open it up these should all appear as they are. I'm going to be using a size 3 brush with 100% hardness, and this is hopefully going to be something useful to you. Now my canvas size is 512 by 512, and this is a good size to practice in, a good size to work with. Now the first shape we're going to create is cuts. Cuts and splits tend to be the most common kind of hand paintable shape that we need to create, but they're also the easiest. Now I'm going to create some Wolverine scratches. We know what they look like. They look something like this. So I'm going to make sure I'm in my outline layer and I've got my my black selected here. If we've got any other colours in here except black and white, just click on the black and white box at the top here. That will turn those in. So let's paint some Wolverine scratches. And these are just 3 really simple scratches. They look something like that. Now what we've painted here is kind of almost a very rudimentary shadow. You can imagine these as putting a hole in the canvas, but they don't look 3D yet, and the reason why they don't look 3D yet is because we don't actually have any light reacting to this detail. So let's add some of that in. I'm going to select my light layer and I'm just going to flick to white. And my light's going to be coming in from this direction, which means that it's not going to catch this side of the line, it's going to catch this side. So I'm going to very lightly just put some of this in place. So on the right hand side I'm going to very lightly just paint some of this light in here. And that's really what we're doing. When we're adding in this highlight layer, we're just painting in just where that light is reacting to the surface there. Like so, and hopefully you can see that that looks pretty 3D. It's not perfect, we've done it quickly, things will get better as we progress, but you can kind of see that this is a kind of a really basic 3D detail. We've added some scratches. But what if we wanted these to perhaps look more like gouges, even kind of add in some of this some perspective detail here? Maybe we want to see further into this. Well, let's have a look at what that would look like. I'm going to come back to my outline layer and I'm going to just do another 3 scratches. This time around, however, I'm going to jump into my shadows layer and I'm going to change my brush size. I'm going to change my brush size to 5. I'm also going to change the hardness down to about 50%. Let's have a look at the difference that this makes. Now on the same side as the highlights, I'm just going to add in very lightly a shadow here, very lightly. I don't worry, not particularly worried if it's messy. It'll actually make it look better if it's messy. Very lightly just adding this in here, like so. Let's come back to the light layer. We need to change our brush settings back to 3. Move this back to 100. And then we'll switch our light layers over here. And then we can add in our highlights again. And as I follow these, you can kind of see the difference that this makes here to a lot of these scratches. And as I kind of follow this, you'll see that it doesn't just look like a flat scratch, it looks a little bit more jagged. And in fact it almost looks like we can see into this. Now again, if I come to my shadows layer and I switch to black, we can really make this look even more impressive by just going over some of the detail in here and just darkening the other side. And hopefully by doing that you can really see the way that this material now pops off the screen. It really looks like we're seeing into this material as opposed to we're just seeing the top of it. So currently these materials both look particularly blurry. They don't look very, very sharp. We can change this. Now I'm just going to label these just for convenience. This is going to be scratch number 1. This is going to be scratch number 2. And this is going to be our perspective scratch. This is going to be our simple scratch. We need to sharpen these up, and we can do this really simply. Now, we all saw our sharp highlights layer earlier. That's where this comes in. Now the sharp highlights layer, I use this almost like anti-aliasing. And let's have a look at the settings for the brush. We need it to be white. We know it's a highlight layer. I'm now going to come to my pen, and we want a 1 pixel brush. We want to make sure that the hardness is 100%. And we also want to change the opacity over here to about 50%. Anything between 40 and 50 is fine. And I want you to see the difference that this makes. I'm pressing very lightly again, but I'm just going to follow these highlights here. And I'm being quite short and sharp with my brush strokes. I want this to look a little bit random. We can always use the sharp highlights to bring out the shadows on the other side, but again we've got to press so lightly that we can hardly see the light. And if that line breaks, do you know what? That's absolutely fine. The whole point of this is just to kind of bring out some of that depth. Let's continue on with this. Press a little bit harder now, like so. And finally, we do this like so. And if for whatever reason you haven't quite followed the line, that's perfect. What we can do is where we've got this now, this dark section, we can actually create another sharp highlight there and really create some detail. And again, I'm just going to very lightly just do the opposite side here. I'm not even going to go all the way along. I'm just going to kind of almost dot along that line. And you can really see the way that this works. Now let's have a look at our perspective and see the effect that this has. It's exactly the same technique. And again we can kind of see, add the highlight on the other side. And you can see that that really sharpens that up. Now the reason why I put these in separate layers is really simple. Sometimes our sharp highlights come on a little bit strong. Now over here they're okay, but I think here perhaps they're a little bit too strong. And if this happens, you don't need to panic. All we need to do is just remove some of the opacity on that particular light, that particular layer. And you can see that eventually this has the desired effect. So let's continue now on to the others. Like so, it looks awesome, and then we can finish off just doing the last one here. Just finishing off the opposite edge here, like so. Okay, awesome. So that's essentially what we are using these layers for. Sharp highlights really sharpens up a lot of the light detail we're going to add in. The light is kind of the broad light. Shadows deals with the basic depth, and outline is all of the initial kind of outline areas that we're going to be using. Now sharp highlights has another function as well, specifically where we're looking at perspective. Now there are lots of areas here where we can add our own little kind of spin on some of the details. So here for instance, I don't know if you can see this, but around here we've got a lighter area here and a darker area. Well, we can actually use the highlight to paint that area into the scratch. And you can see just by adding a very faint line there, we end up forcing this kind of perspective. And we can do this with some of the others. Here for instance we've got another little detail here, so I'm just going to put that in place very lightly, like so. I can also do this the other side, and I will. And you can really see the effect that this has, just these two little things have on the material as it is. And really, hand painted materials, it's about adding in these really small finishing touches, and that's what the sharp highlight layer is absolutely excellent for. So let's have a look at putting this into a little bit of practice. So I'm going to come back to my outline, I'm going to switch to black, and I want to go back to my 3 pixel brush. I'm I'm going to change my opacity to 25 again. And let's apply this to something that's a little bit cool. That it's kind of rocks or stone based, and we're going to create a little brick paving material here. This is going to be example number 3, so I'll put a little 3 here. And let's have a look at how we can do this. Now we're going to start by just painting a little square shape. I'm not worrying about being particularly neat. I notice that my lines aren't straight, some of my edges are a little bit messy. That's absolutely fine. Now this second brick is not going to be quite as long. I'm going to make this a little bit shorter. And then this next brick I'm going to have as kind of 2 smaller bricks that end up being the same size as my slightly larger brick. And I'm going to finish this off by having another longer brick just on the end here. Don't worry if this isn't particularly neat. All we're looking for is this being somewhat uniform, and we're going to replicate something like this down here. Now whenever we're doing brick materials, and this kind of doesn't relate particularly to this tutorial, it's just a good piece of advice, we want to try and kind of bridge these little gaps here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a long brick that bridges across the first gap, or the first connections of the bricks above. I'm trying to round off some of these corners so they don't look quite so man-made, even though they are, but we want them to look a little bit worn. And then when we come to here, we can add in things like the shorter bricks, and then finally we can add in things like the square bricks that we added here. So I'm just going to fill this in, and then we can apply some of these materials here. So I'm not worrying too much about the quality of this. I'm just literally painting. In the next tutorial we're going to be having a look at how we can create kind of a cobblestone material using these very simple techniques. So here we have a very badly drawn brick kind of material. You can kind of see the layout here, and this is what we are trying to do. Now the difference between this and this is I want to change the light direction. Up until now this has been the way that we're working. This time round I don't want to come in from this direction. I want to come straight from the top. Now this changes the way that we light these bricks and the way we do the shadows. So let's focus on the shadows first. I always find it easiest to paint shadows first, although this is not something that you specifically have to do. Again, I'm going to double my brush size. Use 6 instead of 5. Again, I'm going to keep my opacity low. You might even want to make it lower than that, to be honest. We really want to press light here. Now when we have the light from the top, only the top is going to receive the light. These 3 edges are going to receive shadow. So let's start implementing this. Just make sure we're actually got the right colour enabled, otherwise you end up looking like a fool. So let's paste in some of these shadows here. Paint these in again. I'm just following the outlines really. I'm not worrying too much about the neatness. If you want to cut corners, please do. This just ends up making the brick look a little bit more chiseled. So if you want the brick to kind of end up looking like somebody's hammered away at it or it's been damaged, cutting corners is an excellent way of doing that. An excellent way of really creating some interesting detail. Just cut the corner. Just with a single line really. We don't want anything too complex. Again, if I show you here, this has got a nice curved corner this side, but this side's kind of almost a right angle. So I'll add my curve in here. When I get to this corner, I'm just going to draw a line there. And can you see how it looks like the corner of that rock's been sort of chipped off? That's what we're going for. We're going to capitalise that later, or capitalise on that later with our sharp highlight layer. Don't be afraid to go over some of these shadows as well, by the way. Just to kind of bring out some of these details. Some of these shadows in the middle here we can go over. Just in between the bricks. As you notice that these don't look dark enough, you can kind of add these in. Add in some of these shadows here. Some of these shadows here, and finally we'll add in some of these shadows just along here. So now let's switch to light. Let's switch our canvas to white. Now I'm not going to worry too much about changing my brush settings. Instead, I'm just going to add in a very faint highlight across the top here. just made Donald Trump. I don't want to make Donald Trump. When I said don't worry about being messy, if we can get the highlights on the brick, that would be really useful. So again, I'm just adding in some of these options here, some of these highlights. And again, don't worry if they're messy. It's okay for them to be messy. Okay, I'm just going to add a little bit to this one here. This looks a little bit bare, and so does this one. Okay, excellent. Hopefully you can see that this looks pretty 3D currently, but it's really blurry. Now, as we discussed up here, we can use our sharp highlights layer to really sharpen this up. So let's do that. Let's see what that looks like. Increase my opacity to maybe 50%. And I'm just going to zoom in here so we can really see what we're doing. Now, these bricks lend themselves really nicely to this type of detail. Now, before I add any of that in, I'm just going to kind of go over and show you how we can create some really cool little details. Now, I told you to cut the corners earlier. This one here, for instance, is an excellent example. In fact, let's have a look at this one. This is probably the easiest one to show you. So I'm going to start at the top, and again, the sharp highlight layer, what we're going to be doing is we're just going to be going over some of the detail that we added. I'm not going to be pressing particularly hard at the bottom. I'm just going to be following that detail there. Now, where we've got this cut corner, this actually lends itself really well to some of these smaller details. And the same thing over here. And again, the same thing at the top here, where I've got this detail here. And we can start adding in these imaginary details as we come across these other brick shape type things. We can start adding in similar kinds of detail. The trick is not to press too hard with the pen. What we don't want to do is kind of end up with big bright white lines everywhere. And what I'm doing is just following these highlights, and I'm trying to make this as simple as I can. So again, I'm just kind of adding in some of these areas here, and where we've got areas where there's lots of kind of different shapes, I'm just adding highlights to them, and this really just brings them out. You kind of see things here. They're not things I've put in. They're just shapes that have sort of emerged as I've spammed the shadow layer over the top of itself, and we've just created this kind of highlight in this shadow. Okay, so I'm just going to add these to each of these, and then I'll zoom out, and you'll really see the difference that we're creating here. And again, where we've got these little areas of different kind of levels of highlight, we can really capitalize on those just by creating almost like just going over the top of them with our sharp highlight layer. Again, don't be afraid to cut the corners here as well. This makes it kind of look like we end up with this sort of stage damage where we've got chipped outside sections, chipped corners, beveled corners, these kinds of things. I'm always making these stones kind of look warped. The most important thing is to keep that design nice and interesting. I'm going to kind of speed it up a little bit here so we can have a look at what the finished product kind of looks like. And this final little area here. So let's kind of zoom out, and hopefully if we zoom out you can really see the difference that has. Now, we reduced the opacity of this layer earlier, so if we increase that again, we can really sharpen up some of those stones, or we can really decrease it. The most important thing is that we can see that this is kind of sharpened up those highlights and shadows. Now, we can combine these two kinds of techniques here. We can kind of add in detail, we can add in cuts and slashes, and this becomes really simple. Just select I don't even need to change my brush size. If we want nice kind of thin looking cuts, well, we can add these in. Add one there. Let's cut off the corner of one of these actually. So the reason why this kind of line changes as I draw this is purely because we're trying to create this illusion that we have some form of perspective here. So if I just drew a line straight over there, you can see it ignores the shape of that stone. What I want to do when I get to this highlight here is actually follow the shape of that stone. And as this kind of progresses up and kind of creates a little split, we'll get to the top here, and again I'll just replicate the look of that. So I'm just kind of going over here really lightly just to create some shadow, just to create some different detail. And now we can come to the sharp highlight layer, switch to white, and all it becomes a case of doing is just going over some of this detail. Like so. And if I zoom out here, you can really see we end up creating something that looks like splits. Scratches are again exactly the same technique. I just switch to white. We can add in these sharp highlights here. And you can end up creating these really cool looking kind of materials. And you can tell with some development this would end up looking pretty cool. With some color this would end up looking pretty cool. So let's add some color to this. Now adding color to these grayscale paintings is really simple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer right at the top, and I'm going to call this color. Now we need to use layer blending here just to enable this color to really take effect. And what we can do is we can change normal to overlay. Now I'm going to pick a color. I'm going to increase the size of my brush. This just helps us paint this a little bit quicker. Maybe something like 15 is good. Now I want something in here. I want something kind of almost sandy. Something over here works quite well. I want something that's quite sandy but still quite grey. And what we can do is we can actually paint over the top of this. So as we've got this colour here, we can paint one or two of these bricks in this colour. We can even increase the opacity and add in some of this colour here. But not all of these colours have to be sensible. If I want kind of a bright blue, well actually, do you know what, I can paint that in. And it ends up kind of maintaining that detail there. I'll just paint this up. And we can select all kinds of colours here. I can get bright red. I can get bright yellow, or bright green should I say. Yeah, bright green's a good one. This acid, disgusting colour. So we can get kind of like a luminous kind of purpley pink. Oh yes, that's what we want. All of the desert stones look something like this, but you get the point. As we can kind of like overlay these colours, we can even kind of overlay on top of each other, kind of create interesting effects, almost creating kind of like a Splatoon type thing. But you get the point. We can overlay any colour that we like, and we can create some really interesting looking materials. Again, we can also reduce the opacity of these colours. This helps kind of make them a little bit more pastel, but I like them when we've got really sharp colours. Now in terms of creating hand painted materials, that is pretty much it. I hope this has been useful. In the next tutorial we're going to be looking at how we can create a rock material. If you have any requests, if you want me to have a look specifically at wood materials, let me know down below. As I say, I hope this has been useful, and I look forward to showing you some cool stuff again next time.